Okay, let's dive in. We're looking today at a market that, well, maybe doesn't come up every day, but the sources you've brought show some really interesting movement. Nitrocyclohexane.
That's the one. Yeah, we've got this report here. Gives a pretty detailed picture, looks back at how it's performed, what's happening now, and um, where it seems to be going over the next decade or so.
And the time frame is pretty specific, right? We're talking 2021, looking forward all the way to 2033.
Exactly, 12 years. And the headline number, the global figure, is quite something.
It really is. The report suggests the market's set to more than double from, what was it, $420.51 million back in 2021.
Yeah, up to a projected $947.06 million by 2033.
That's huge. And that works out to a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR, of 7%.
7%, yeah, over that whole period. So think of it like the average yearly growth if it was smooth, and 7% over, 12 years. That points to pretty strong, consistent demand building up.
Definitely. So, okay, for our deep dive today, the plan isn't just reading out figures. We want to get behind them,
Right.
understand the story. Like, what's actually driving this growth?
Exactly.
And where is it happening?
Right.
Because it's probably not the same everywhere across the globe.
No, absolutely not. And that's where the regional breakdown in the report gets really insightful. You see the different speeds and scales. It shows that, yeah, the overall market's growing, but some areas are moving much, much faster.
Okay, so let's start there. Which region does the report flag as, well, the front runner, the
Yeah.
biggest and the fastest growing?
Right. That would be Asia Pacific. No question. It was already the biggest chunk of the market in 2021, about $202.26 million.
Okay.
But the projection for 2033, it's $481.11 million.
Wow. More than double.
More than double. And that gives it the highest regional CGR globally, 7.5%.
7.5%. So that's even higher than the global average of 7%.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's really pulling that average up.
So within APAC, what's driving that? Which specific areas are contributing most?
Well, China is a huge part of it, just in terms of sheer volume. The report sees it going from about $68 million to over $165 million.
Okay, so China's the volume leader.
Definitely. But what's maybe even more interesting, or at least striking in terms of growth rate, is India.
Oh.
Yeah, India starts smaller, about $27 million in 2021, but the report projects it to hit $71.2 million by 2033. And that growth rate, its CAGR, is pegged at 8.39%. That's the highest for any single country mentioned.
8.39%. That's really flying. What does that suggest about what's happening in India specifically?
Well, it strongly suggests, major industrial expansion. Something is using a lot more nitrocyclohexane, maybe new applications, or just rapidly growing existing ones. It fits perfectly with the report's general point about demand booming in emerging markets.
Right, right. Okay, so China for volume, India for that really accelerated growth rate. Who else is important in APAC?
Japan and South Korea are also significant players. Projections for 2033 put them around $67 million and $43 million, respectively. And another thing that really jumps out is Southeast Asia, treated as sort of a combined area in the report. It's projected to nearly triple, from about $18 million up to over $45 million.
Triple. Wow, even from a smaller base, that's a massive percentage increase.
Exactly. It points to really dynamic economic activity across several countries there. And then you've got steady growth mentioned for places like Singapore, Taiwan, Australia. Plus, the rest of APAC's category also more than doubles, from around $12.5 million to nearly $30 million.
So it sounds like a really broad-based surge across the whole region, but with some real hotspots like India and Southeast Asia.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so APAC is clearly the high-growth engine here. Let's switch continents. What about North America? What story does the report tell there?
North America's growth is described as more steady, still very significant, of course. The report links this partly to its, well-established industrial base.
Makes sense.
The numbers show it growing from roughly $94 million in 2021 to $193 million by 2033. The CAGR is solid, 6.2%.
So good growth, but a bit slower than APAC's pace.
Exactly. Steady, strong share.
And within North America, I assume the U.S. is the main player.
Oh, yeah, by far. Projected to go from about $76.5 million to over $155 million. Canada is next, expected to grow from around $10.6 million to almost $24 million, and Mexico from about $6.6 million up to $14 million.
Okay, so consistent growth across the board led by the U.S.
Pretty much, yeah, driven by that existing industrial demand.
Right. How does Europe compare, another region with a big industrial footprint?
Very similar story to North America, actually. The report shows Europe maintaining a significant, steady share. The market size is forecast to reach about $115.5 million by 2033, up from $56 million or so in 2021.
Yeah, growth rate.
The CAGR is 6.26%, almost identical to North America's 6.2%. So again, aligns with that idea of demand tied to established industries.
Interesting how close those growth rates are. Which countries are the main contributors in Europe?
Looking at the 2033 figures,
Yeah.
Germany leads at around $24 million. Then you've got the UK near $16 million, France around $13.5 million, Italy just over $13 million, and Spain over $10 million.
Okay, the major economies.
Right. And the report also mentions healthy growth in some emerging European markets, too. The rest of Europe category is projected to more than double, from about $6.5 million to $13.5 million.
So North America and Europe, big, mature markets, growing steadily, just a bit under that global average rate. Contrasting with that faster acceleration in Asia-Pacific, where else are we seeing notable expansion?
South America is definitely picking up speed. The report puts its market growing from around $25.6 million in 2021 to nearly $60 million by 2033.
Okay, and who's leading there?
Brazil is the largest, projected to hit about $23 million by 2033. Argentina follows, expected around $11.5 million. And the report also specifically mentions Colombia, Peru, and Chile, showing...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
And the report also specifically mentions Colombia, Peru, and Chile, showing, quote, healthy double-digit million-dollar projections. So solid growth across several key economies there. The rest of South America adds another $8 million or so to the total.
Good to see that growth spreading out. Okay, how about the Middle East?
The Middle East is also showing significant traction, according to the report, forecast to grow from just over $22 million to over $51 million by 2033.
And the key players?
Saudi Arabia and the UAE stand out. Projections are for $14.2 million and $8.6 million, respectively.
Right.
But other markets like Turkey, Egypt, Qatar are mentioned as active too. And the rest of the region adds about another $6.5 million. This growth probably ties into some of the industrial diversification we hear about in the region.
That makes sense. Okay, and finally, Africa.
Africa's market is also projected to see substantial growth, from about $20 million in 2021 to roughly $46 million by 2033.
And within Africa?
South Africa is the biggest single market, expected to reach nearly $20 million by 2033. Nigeria is also mentioned, projected around $5.8 million. And the rest of Africa category is actually quite significant, projected to hit over $20 million itself.
Okay. Wow, that's covered the globe. So if we just sort of pull back from all those specific numbers for a second, what's the big picture the report paints for nitrocyclohexane globally over the next decade?
Yeah, stepping back, the report clearly shows robust growth pretty much everywhere, across all the major regions we looked at.
Right.
But the really interesting part is the difference in that growth. Asia-Pacific is, well, it's the powerhouse. It's got the fastest overall growth rate, driven by China's massive scale, but also that incredible acceleration in places like India and Southeast Asia.
Which ties into that emerging market demand point.
Exactly. Then you contrast that with North America and Europe. Big markets, yes, growing substantially, but more steadily, consistent with demand from their, existing industrial base.
Steady versus accelerated.
Right. And then you have South America, the Middle East, Africa, all showing healthy expansion too, suggesting increasing industrial activity is taking hold there as well. It's a broad picture of rising demand.
And the report basically puts this down to two main things.
Yeah, it boils down to 1, diverse industrial uses for nitrocyclohexane, and 2, that expanding demand, especially coming from these emerging economies.
Okay, so we've really unpacked those numbers, looked at the regional differences, seen the overall trend. Nitrocyclohexane is clearly part of a bigger global growth story. Different speeds in different places, the acceleration in Asia, the steady growth in North America and Europe.
It definitely paints a vivid picture of, global industry expanding.
So looking at all this data laid out, this market more than doubling, these different regional patterns, what does that signal to you about maybe wider trends in the chemical sector or just industrial development generally? It feels like one piece in a much bigger economic jigsaw.
Oh, absolutely. It's a small indicator of larger shifts. And that leads to a really interesting question. The report kind of leaves hanging, doesn't it? Well, it says growth is driven by diverse industrial applications and emerging market demand, but it doesn't specify which industries. So the question for you to think about is, What specific industries do you think are really guzzling nitrocyclohexane right now, especially in those super high growth areas like India or Southeast Asia?
Right.
And then taking it a step further, how might the boom in those particular industries, whatever they are, actually start to reshape the bigger global economic picture over the next 10 years, beyond just the numbers for this one chemical? That's definitely something to chew on. Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into, well, what sounds like a really specific market, nitrocyclohexane.
Yeah, it sounds niche, doesn't it?
It really does, and you might be thinking, why this one? But that's kind of the point of this deep dive, using your source material here, these market report excerpts.
Right, because looking into these seemingly small corners often tells you a lot about the bigger picture. Big industries, global trends.
Exactly. You find these surprising links. So our mission today, take this report you've got, unpack what's driving growth for nitrocyclohexane, what's holding it back, and where things seem to be heading.
Sounds good. It's fascinating how one chemical intermediate can sort of mirror these larger forces, tech changes, regulations, global demand shifts, all that.
Okay, let's get into it. So based on the report, why do people actually use nitrocyclohexane? What's its main job?
Well, the core thing the report highlights is its function as an intermediate, a critical one.
An intermediate. Okay, so not the final product people buy off the shelf, but like a vital step in making something else.
Exactly. It's essential mid-process. The source mentions its growing use in organic synthesis and into making other intermediates.
So it's a building block.
A key precursor, yeah. Think of it as a foundation for chemists building more complex molecules.
Yeah.
Specifically, it helps create amines and these cyclohexyl-based derivatives.
And those are important because...
Well, they're foundational themselves, for a huge range of things, specialty chemicals, fine chemicals, especially agrochemicals.
Ah, okay. And I think we saw in the material it gets integrated into pretty complex multi-step synthesis routes.
That's right. So for industries making really intricate compounds, using nitrocyclohexane can make the whole process more efficient. Sometimes it's the only practical way.
It makes sense. So beyond just how it's used chemically, what's driving the demand, the report pointed to specific industries growing.
Yes, that's a major driver. The really strong growth globally in pharmaceuticals and agrochemicals.
Right, and this is where those connections you mentioned start popping up for the listener. It's used a lot in making the active ingredients.
Exactly. For things like pesticides, herbicides, and also actual pharmaceuticals, active compounds.
So think about global trends, like agriculture needing to produce more food, especially in developing regions.
Precisely. That pressure boosts demand for crop protection products, which means more demand for the intermediates, like nitrocyclohexane, used to make them.
And it's a similar story in pharma, I guess, with that industry expanding, especially in emerging markets?
Absolutely. Making complex drugs often requires these reliable intermediates. So its demand is tied directly to, well, global health and food security needs. Pretty fundamental stuff.
The source material also mentioned another key area, didn't it? Something about polymers and dyes.
It did, yes. Another significant use is in producing polymers and dyes.
How does it fit in there?
It's used to make dye intermediates and additives for polymers, specifically things like synthetic colorants and also stabilizers to make plastics last longer.
Okay, so that touches industries like textiles, plastics, coatings.
Correct. And as industrial production grows, especially in places like the Asia-Pacific region, which are seeing rapid growth, the need for those colorants and additives goes up too.
So more demand for nitrocyclohexane again. Okay, that paints a pretty clear picture of the demand side. It's a key ingredient for big, growing, global sectors.
Definitely strong drivers.
But, like you said, there are always other forces at play. What about the challenges, the restraints mentioned in the report? What's the main worry?
Well, the material's pretty upfront about this. The number one issue, really the core tension here, is the compound's toxicological profile.
It's safety, basically.
Yes, it's flagged as a hazardous chemical.
Hazardous how? What kind of risks are we talking about?
The report mentions things like flammability, skin irritation, and neurotoxicity.
Neurotoxicity. So it can affect the nervous system.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It's not something to be handled lightly.
And that obviously has knock-on effects. Strict safety rules, special equipment needed.
Absolutely. You need rigorous safety protocols, advanced handling infrastructure, proper ventilation, containment, specialized training for workers.
Which sounds expensive.
It is. And that's a major economic barrier. Setting all that up, plus the ongoing compliance costs, It could be just too much for smaller companies or for facilities in regions maybe without robust safety systems already in place.
So the result is some potential users...
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Safety systems already in place.
So the result is some potential users might just say, you know what, let's find something else, an alternative that's less hazardous, less hassle.
Exactly. Even if nitrocyclohexane works well chemically, the safety overhead might push them to alternatives. It definitely limits how widely it can be adopted.
Okay, so safety is a big one. What else? Environmental regulations came up too, right?
Yes. Another significant hurdle. Especially in places like the US and the EU, there are very stringent rules.
Rules covering what exactly?
Things like occupational exposure limits how much workers can be exposed to safely. Also, strict rules on waste disposal and on emissions in the environment, air and water.
And again, that adds complexity and cost.
Definitely. It affects everything from the manufacturing process itself to transport and storage. You need special procedures, documentation.
And the report suggests this actually limits how much the market can scale up, because not everyone can afford that level of investment in compliance.
That's the implication. It makes it harder, particularly for companies that aren't large chemical players with deep pockets for regulatory affairs.
The report mentioned a third factor too, didn't it? Something about awareness and substitutes.
It did. Kind of two related points. One is just a lack of awareness, maybe, about how versatile nitrocyclohexane can actually be, especially outside the core chemical industry circles.
So people might not even realize it's an option for their process.
Potentially. And then even if they are aware, there's the presence of substitutes, other chemicals that might do a similar job, perhaps perceived as safer or easier to handle.
Right. So if you can get a similar outcome with something that has fewer regulatory hoops to jump through or simpler logistics,
you might just choose that path, even if nitrocyclohexane has some technical advantages.
Oh.
So that limited knowledge, combined with readily available alternative, can definitely restrict growth in some areas.
Okay, so it's this real push and pull. Strong demand from key industries, but serious headwinds from the safety profile and regulations.
A classic tension.
Given those significant hurdles, you might think the market's just kind of stuck. But the source material points to some interesting trends, ways the industry is adapting.
Yeah, it's not static. One key trend is this increase in research, both academic and industrial, looking into functionalized nitro compounds, and that includes nitrocyclohexane.
So people are actively exploring new things to do with it, despite the challenges.
Exactly. They're looking at areas like advanced material science, new pharmaceutical applications, trying to find novel uses.
And this is leading to what, like higher purity versions? The report mentioned lab-grade variants?
Correct. It's not just about the bulk industrial stuff anymore. There's a push towards developing these highly refined grades with specific properties for potentially high-value niche applications. New avenues are opening up.
Interesting. What else is changing?
Another big one is the growth of custom manufacturing. Contract synthesis services.
How does that play into this market?
Well, think about those pharma and agrochemical companies we talked about. Increasingly, they outsource parts of their manufacturing or synthesis.
Right. They hire specialists to make specific chemicals for them.
Exactly. And those specialists, the contract manufacturers, need intermediates. But often, they need them in very specific, tailored formulations or purity levels for their client's unique process.
Ah, so it's not just give me nitrocyclohexane, it's give me this specific grade prepared this specific way.
Precisely. And the nitrocyclohexane suppliers are responding. They're becoming more flexible, setting up production to meet these custom demands, not just turning out one standard product.
That makes total sense. The supply chain evolving to meet customer needs. Okay, what was the final trend highlighted?
A really important one, given the restraints. A significant shift towards safer and more environmentally sustainable production methods.
Which sounds crucial if they want to overcome those safety and regulatory barriers we discussed.
It absolutely is. Manufacturers are actively adopting things like cleaner synthesis techniques, better containment systems.
It's like closed-loop processes, maybe. Better ways to handle waste.
Those are the kinds of examples mentioned, yes. Things like advanced waste treatment solutions, too.
And the benefit there is twofold, I guess.
Exactly. On the one hand, it helps them meet the regulations and address the safety concerns, potentially reducing risk and compliance costs over time.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it also positions nitrocyclohexane better in the global market. Sustainability is increasingly important, right? So being able to offer an intermediate made through greener processes could become a competitive advantage.
Right, turning a problem into potentially a selling point. Interesting.
So when you look at everything the report covers, you're left with this core tension, this balancing act.
Yeah, you've got this really useful chemical, clearly essential for huge global industries, pharma, agrochemicals, polymers.
Yeah, it comes with significant baggage. It's hazardous, heavily regulated, and there are alternatives out there.
And then layered on top of that, you have these positive trends, the research finding new uses, the custom synthesis meeting specific needs.
And critically, that push towards safer, greener production methods.
So the big question the source material leaves you pondering is, can those trends really overcome the fundamental challenges?
Yeah, can the innovation in research, the flexibility in manufacturing, and the investment in sustainability actually lower the risk profile and the cost burden enough to unlock wider use?
Or will those inherent hazards and regulatory complexities continue to limit its potential compared to other options? What's the final balance going to look like?
That's really the crux of it.
It's a fascinating snapshot. We've taken you through the drivers pulling demand from vital global sectors, the serious restraints tied to its nature and the rules around it, and these emerging trends showing adaptation and innovation. And hopefully, seeing these dynamics play out in a specialized market like nitrocyclohexane gives you a better sense of how interconnected everything is: global growth, supply chains, safety, regulations, and that constant drive for innovation and sustainability that touches so many parts of our economy and ultimately the products you encounter every single day.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.